Welcome back, and it's the next step of painting all the miniatures for Warhammer Age of Sigmar Soul Wars, and here they all are, undercoated and ready for painting. And at this stage it's a little bit daunting, isn't it, when you've got all these undercoated figures all ready to paint, just sitting there, and you think this is going to take hours and hours and hours. But relax, put on a nice podcast, get your paints all set up, have a nice working area, and take the time, enjoy yourself, and let's get painting. Now, when you're doing a whole batch of figures like this, it's a good idea to do one test miniature so you establish the style that you're going to carry on through all the other miniatures. So I'm going to take this one chain rasp and paint it up and make sure that I'm happy with its look before I start doing the other 19 or so of them. So let's go through the process of painting this one figure together. Now, I've worked out this vague idea that the weaker figures are going to be more ethereal, whereas the stronger, more hero-like figures are going to be darker and more solid. So these wimpy guys are going to be all ghosty. In the Games Workshop version, they have a dark sort of shroud over the top, which I don't like as much. So I'm going to coat this all over with an ethereal colour. Now, they've actually made some special paint for this. There's one Night Haunt Gloom, which is a bluey one, and there's a greeny one as well. But what I'm going to use is a mixture of the two, so I've got somewhere in between, and I'm going to use Nilac or Nilac Oxide. So I get some of this on my palette. Now, I'm using a wet palette here, which is highly recommended. Wet palettes are great. They're great for preserving your paint for a longer period, and they're also good for blending colours together. So I've got that, and I'm also going to get some Lahmian Medium to make this a bit more liquid or thinner, so it'll go on a thinner wash. So start putting that on, and you can see already that's going into the recesses. Make sure you get right in there. It flows into the recesses and hopefully flows off the highlights. Make sure you haven't missed anything. There we go. Now, using a bit of paper towel, I'm just going to soak up some of the excess which is on the highlighted areas, and just make sure it's not pooling in any kind of weird ways or pooling too heavily in the recesses. I can also push it around a little bit if there's any bits I've missed. There's a bit I've missed there and another bit down there. It's surprisingly easy to miss areas when you're doing this, so really look very carefully and make sure you haven't missed any spots. Now I'm going to let this dry thoroughly. Of course, if I was doing a whole batch of these, I could do a whole series of these, maybe 5 or 6 at a time, and then by the time I'd finish them I could go back to the first one and it would be ready to work on again. But I'm just doing one to start with, so let's let that dry. Okay, that's dry now, so the next thing I'm going to do is paint the metal areas, and I've got some lead belcher on my paintbrush, so I'll just paint the area of the axe. I can do that roughly because I'll be painting over the haft of the axe with a darker colour. Like that. And then I'm going to do the chain, and with the chain, now there are different ways you can do this, of course, it's completely up to you, but I've decided that the chain is going to blend into the ectoplasmic nature of the ghost. So where it joins the ghost, well, you could either call it a glow or you could call it getting ectoplasmic, whatever you want. But I'm just cleaning off my brush a little bit, and then I'm just dabbing the metal colour so it blends a little bit into the ghost colour. Like so. Now you could paint this whole area metal if you wanted to, but I'm just doing it this way. So there we go. It just blends in. It's very easy to do, and that way the metal becomes ectoplasmic when it's close to the ghost, and as it gets further away it becomes more metallic. A little bit tricky to get in amongst all these little spiky swirly bits. Just do it neatly. Oops, see, there I have to touch the thing. If you do touch paint to another area, if you clean your brush off in water and just put some water on it, sometimes you can wipe off what you've done. See, I've just wiped off the bit of metallic that I accidentally got on that bit there. There we go. There's my metal areas done. Again, let that dry. Next I'm going to paint the haft of the ghost's weapon, and for this I'm using a mix of black and rhinox hide to give a very dark brown. Now what I'm doing, where it gets close to the ghosty bit, I'm just cleaning off my brush, drying it out a little bit. Then I'm just going to just sort of blend that in with a dryish brush. So it kind of blends with the ghosty colour. And you could call that a glow from the ghost, or you could call it ectoplasmic or whatever, but it just makes it a bit more interesting. You can of course bring the colour right up to the edge of the ghost's hand if you wish. A little bit inside there. Ooh. And clean off my brush, dry it off, and then just blend that in a bit. Wiping paint off as I go. And there you go. Now the next step is to wash these metal areas, and I'm using a mixture of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. So that gives me a blacky browny colour. And then I'll wash these metallic areas. Makes them look a bit old and oily. I'm just washing the centre of the chain there, blending it a bit. The next step is to highlight the ghost itself, and for this I've mixed some white into my wash mixture and a little bit of grey as well, just to give it a grey feel. And then you just start painting it onto the raised areas of the miniature. Now this step is sometimes hard for beginners because they don't really know where to paint. The trick is just to imagine that the light is coming from the top of the miniature, and imagine which areas the light would hit and which would remain in shadow. And you're also of course painting the raised areas of folds and leaving the darkened areas in shadow. So for this mid-grey white, I'm putting on quite a lot on the raised areas. And then with the lighter white, I'll be highlighting just the edges to add more definition. But it's pretty easy with these figures because they've got very well defined folds. Also, if you need to blend into a shadow area a bit more, you can take some of the paint off your brush and just feather the colour out a bit. If it's slightly wet, just feather it out. Now I get my lighter white and just paint the edges, and also the areas that are really going to hit or be hit by the light right at the top of the head, and just a little bit around the edges to define them. Bottom of the eye sockets, the chin, just dab the teeth, shoulders of course. When you're doing hands, it's always good to put little dabs of white just on the knuckles. Just those little bright white highlights that really lift up the paint job. You can see you can do it pretty quickly. And it's up to you how carefully you do this and how much you blend it into the rest of the colour. The good thing about a wet palette like this is that I can pick colours where the colours are blended together and use those to smooth out my transitions. And a bit of sharp contrast is sometimes good, because remember, you are viewing these from a distance and you don't always see that really subtle graduation of colour from a distance. Also put a little bit of water on the brush if you want to blend something out a bit more. Just keep working around the miniature until you're happy with the results. You can see, for example, there on that circle, I just highlighted the bottom part of the circle because the light coming down would just hit the bottom part. You can also use the side of the brush to run a highlight along a sharp edge if you need to, like so. There's our ectoplasmic friend. A few more details and we'll be finished. Next I'm going to age that metal a bit by using some riser rust. And I've got an older brush, getting a little bit of that, dabbing it out, most of it off on a towel, and then just stippling it onto the metal area. This gives a nice rust effect. Instant rust. Next thing is Stormhost Silver. We'll use this for some highlights. Just tiny little highlights on the metal areas, not too much. Just along the edge. Perhaps a few little scrapes. Finally, I'm going to darken the shadows a bit with some of that night haunt gloom. I'm just painting this right into the darker areas. You can also use it just to define some of the joins a little bit more. Just wash it in there. Just to add a bit more contrast. Darker shadow between the shackles and the arms, between the fabric and the arms. Go back and highlight a few little areas that have been dirtied up. The last thing I have to do on this figure is the base. Of course, how you paint your bases will vary depending on what scheme you pick. I'm using some Mechanicus Standard Grey and black. That gives me a dark base colour. And then I'll let this dry and dry brush it with a heavy dry brush of Mechanicus Standard Grey, and then a lighter grey, and then up to a little bit of white. And here's my finished ghost. You can see I've dry brushed the base and I've run black around the edge, and this guy is all ready for varnishing. Now I use a semi-gloss varnish because I like a slight glossness to my figures, but you can use whatever varnish you like. Of course I have to go on now and paint another 19 or so of these little ghosts, all in pretty much the same way, but you can see it's pretty fast, easy technique to get pretty good results. And once all these ghosts are done, I can move on to some more interesting figures. It's up to you, of course, but I prefer to start with the rank and file figures and get them out of the way because they tend to be a little bit more boring and there's more of them. And once they're all done, you've got the pleasure of moving on to the more characterful miniatures.